Before we continue, understand this podcast is for adults only and refers to relationships and activities between adults which are voluntary and consensual. If you or anyone you know is being abused, coerced, or violently aggressed against, please reach out for help to the appropriate authorities.
Tao, hello, and welcome. Gorean Voice, Episode 15, Gor and BDSM. Happy Sunday to you all. This week I'll be short and sweet. I'm going to have a quick look at Gor and BDSM, where they differ, where they overlap, and a smidge of how I incorporate a little BDSM into my lifestyle. So, on the off chance that you're unfamiliar with BDSM, it's a compound initialism. The B and D refer to bondage and discipline, the DNS dominance and submission, and the S&M to sadism and masochism. Now, some Goreans are of the opinion that Gor is a philosophical practice, and that there is zero overlap between BDSM and Gor. I think there is some overlap, but mostly in the B and D and especially the DNS, with hardly anything in the S&M. Take, for instance, the use of restraints. On Gor, restraining a slave is usually a purely practical affair. A Gorean master or some other person who has custody of some slave or other makes use of restraints as dispassionately as does a person on earth walking a dog, handling livestock, or a bailiff transferring a prisoner from court to jail. It's tempting to conclude at first glance that BDSM is basically irrelevant to a Gorean, on Gor or Earth, since the use of restraints, collars, etc. are mostly pragmatic. And yet, throughout the novels, there are numerous examples of the collar being used for far more than merely identifying a slave girl's owner. Phrases from the book such as teaching her collar, or learning her collar, refer specifically to both the mental conditioning that the recently enslaved must undergo in order that they succeed as pleasing slave girls, and to their acceptance or even growing to love their situation. Slave girls are taught to kiss the whip hand, etc. This is not merely to rub their noses in it or to torture them. This is not 1984's Room 101, where Winston Smith must repeat something he knows not to be true. This isn't even the teary finale, where he finally loves Big Brother. This is something else. On Gor, this is using conditioning techniques to make slave girls more effective in their roles. And on Earth, it's borrowing some of that tension to make women into happy, willing slave girls, and take those already collared deeper into such a satisfying path. Consider for a moment a darker side, just how close a genuine, fictional Gorean slave girl's education is to a less glamorous earthly analog, human trafficking and domestic abuse. In both cases, the woman is conditioned to love her trafficker or abuser, and all the same evolutionary triggers are taken advantage of by the pimp or abusive partner, even if he doesn't have an explicit understanding of them. There is a crucial difference between the trafficker/abuser and even a fictional, somewhat brutal Gorean master in the novels, cruel as he may be, that is in favor of the Gorean. He is honest. From the outset, he will tell a woman that she will be trained as his slave, She will learn her place. She is fit only to kneel, etc. He doesn't promise a life of luxury. He promises a life of servitude, and he delivers. Traffickers and abusers, on the other hand, promise all sorts of worldly enticements. They promise love or a better job in another place, or an exciting, glitzy lifestyle that looks and smells like expensive drinks, exotic cars, and living in hotels. What they deliver is something else entirely. Traffickers and other abusers make use of all available means of coercing and controlling their victims, including chemically by means of addiction and by threatening exposure or violence towards their nearest and dearest, not to mention generous helpings of actual violence. The fictional Gorean master has no need to conceal his techniques of domination, and needs employ fewer of them, as slavery is something of an accepted social norm on Gor. On the other hand, the earthly Gorean master has one fairly narrow path to tread, as slavery is not an accepted cultural or social norm on earth. The training, conditioning, and shaping of the girl to be his in the utmost is almost entirely up to him, though there are now limited opportunities for community fellowship. Also, as he is, or should be, a moral actor, many effective techniques of conditioning, training, etc., particularly those which overlap with the coercive habits of traffickers and other abusers, are off limits entirely, or can only be engaged in within the context of informed consent. The one thing, though, that an earthly Gorean man must uphold in the same measure as the fictional Gorean man is the honesty. I personally choose to express the Gorean philosophy as an aesthetic preference rather than a purely biological imperative. But regardless of the justification, an earthly Gorean man must be honest. In this case, I mean he must be honest with the girl that he wants to collar. On a personal note, my Ichiban Dorei-chan, which is a Japanese way of saying my number one slave girl, and I have sought at times a sister slave for her, such that she may have another girl to bear the burdens of dealing with me, and that I might enjoy twice my usual dose of headache. Over the course of correspondence, we make things clear that we are asking for all of her. I spend a good part of our communication warning people about just how totally abject our mode of ownership is, that it is a hard life, etc. This honesty is so important, but it doesn't preclude ordinary tact and manners. If I see a cashier or bank teller, who I happen to think would look great wearing nothing but my collar and a smile, and would sleep comfortably in the kennel under my desk, I don't start the conversation on those topics. I'm not foolish. On the other end of the scale, though, I have a visceral disdain for males who cloak their intentions and desires in so many layers of obfuscation that they become the very personification of what biologists technically call sneaky effers. Back to BDSM, though. Why would I go on and on about the slavery side of Gorean living? Isn't that irrelevant to BDSM? I don't think so. We need to give the devil his due. BDSM aficionados, of rather many stripes, view the Gorean lifestyle as unhealthy or abusive, and I can empathize with this perspective, though I don't share it. In the books, in several of the long pontificative passages that John Norman is known for, he comments that sadomasochism, in particular the sadistic cruelty side, is unlikely to be found on Gor. His reasoning is thus wise. This and other paraphilia are generated by a sick, corrupting, decadent, and degenerate culture, such as the ones found on Earth. Gorean society, being so low in trans fat and other deleterious physical and mental habits, would only produce healthy, naturalistic sexual and parasexual appetites. This may seem a touch prudish from a 2024 perspective, but bear in mind the author began writing these books books in the 60s. The principles and structures which consensual sadomasochistic practices are now associated were nascent at most. Though I'm not a huge fan of sadomasochism myself, I think it is to the good that there are community resources, vetted spaces, workshops, and standards around safety and consent that the subculture has organically built up over the last several decades. From the Gorean side, though, the relevance of BDSM seems to really fall into one of two discrete categories: the deepening of intimate relationships through playful, though possibly edgy experiences, and the symbolic reinforcement or even consummation of the hierarchical relationship between master and kajira. In the first category, which John Norman fans might call the imaginative sex side of BDSM, there are a range of cathartic physical practices which may or may not be adjacent to coitus or other sexual intimacy. I don't want to get into technicalities here, partially since there are many better resources for this topic, and partially because in some cases to name things is to begin to commodify them, and they lose some of their magic. Spankings, floggings, various sorts of creative and artistic bondage, needle play, age regression, power dynamics, role play, costumes, and all manners of fetish-related play can really give people a rush, a peak experience, if you will, help the submissive types get into subspace and experience a type of intimacy that can be quite different from sex, or be experienced alongside sex. Goreans on Earth, nearly to a man, will say, and I'll second the motion, that none of the above are necessarily part of a Gorean lifestyle, even if many Gorean people indulge in them regularly or occasionally. I think indulgence is a key word here. Consider some instrument of bondage, such as a collar. In a fun, playful BDSM context, a collar is essentially an edgy accessory, something to take sexy photos in, or to wear as a component of foreplay. It may or may not lock, and it could be made of anything ranging from heavy steel to thin leather or PVC. Someone may even take their play up a notch and put it on in the morning, under her clothes or a scarf, such that later that evening, when her boyfriend is over, they'll have some fun. Safe, sane, and consensual. Risk-aware consensual kink, and various other initialisms and acronyms apply all the while. She'll likely have a spare key on her, or near at hand for emergencies. On the other end of the spectrum, a woman in a total power exchange, master-slave type relationship will likely wear a collar also, and such a collar may be found no less ravishing or cute than the playful type. But in this girl's case, the collar is a genuine instrument of bondage and control, and is a symbol of ownership. Same goes for tethers, anklets, handcuffs, and chastity belts. In the case of the collared slave girl, though, in addition to being a genuine symbol of slavery and ownership, it can also be used for all manners of fun, and can look just as edgy or sexy, etc., as a BDSM collar. Is it SSC or RAC compliant? Perhaps not, but it's certainly Gorean. Where I think the real meat is, in terms of Gor and BDSM, is in the mental game. Every spanking session, rather than being merely a cathartic release of endorphins, can be that as well as an experience that brings a slave girl deeper into her role. Now please don't understand the word merely above to mean that spanking someone other than your slave girl is a lesser activity, but for a master with a slave girl, it can be an opportunity to help her apprehend her place at your feet and cultivate that perfect obedience she is eager to perform. Same goes for bondage. Sure, tie up a girl with beautiful colored nylon rope, or handcuff that girl and let her drift into subspace with her head in your lap while you pet her. If she's my slave girl, though, I like to stroke her hair while speaking softly into her ear, taking her deeply where I want her to go, which is not merely for a pleasant stay in subspace. I prefer to remodel her mind palace, such that her psyche is all the more completely dedicated to serving and pleasing men in general, and this man in particular. It's obvious how a chastity belt can, rather than being essentially a piece of lingerie, be an instrument of demonstrative ownership and control over a woman. But even fetishes or kink practices that are further removed from intimacy may be employed in the same way. Consider the practice of dress codes, ritualized movements, or the simple behavioral code of not letting your woman touch door handles. These all reinforce a role. No, role isn't quite the right word. They reinforce a status in a woman, the status of slave, of kajira. The fact is, BDSM in a broad yet focused context may be practiced 24 hours a day and mostly hidden in plain sight. My Ichiban Dorei-chan sometimes calls this weak tea, usually when her behind is in need of a fresh handprint. She wears a sturdy yet fashionable collar. The one she has on at the moment is made of titanium, and the locking mechanism is hidden and unknown to her. She hasn't had a naked neck for years, and I always lock on her new collar before removing the previous one when I want to change it, or handcuff her behind her back for the entire exchange, and usually both. The collars she has worn over the years have all been either stainless steel or titanium, and are suitable both for 24/7 wear and for heavy-duty play. It is a symbol of my ownership of her, a constant embrace, an inescapable restraint, and of course, a convenient point by which to leash or tether her. It is a slave collar, absolutely, that is also suitable for BDSM. I'm going to leave it there for BDSM. I'm not keen for this podcast to become a fetish spreadsheet, or to place too much emphasis on the much controverted sexual side of Gorean and other total power exchange relationships. There is one last point I'd like to make to the ladies about safety with respect to bondage and restraints. Remember, cuffs or not, a woman alone with a man is basically under his control. Even if she carries concealed, in close, intimate quarters, firearms aren't terribly useful, and his capacity to overpower her is essentially unhindered. Whether for play or for a deeper side of a relationship, if you want to be near the edge, that's fine. Please just remember that a man within arm's reach of you has you under as much power as he wants. He may need to cross the line and commit a crime in order to exercise that power, but this legal distinction won't do anything for you in the moment. Choose carefully who you spend time alone with. Well, thanks for listening. In a future episode, I'm going to go into the topic of hand signals and wordless commands that a master may issue his slave girl. I'll look at those used in the books, go into some of the ones I use, and some overall ideas about cultivating a commanding, masculine presence. However, please join me again next week when I'll be talking about the all too vulgar concept of body count. It's a topic that deserves attention, but merits a 360-degree look, since it takes two to tango. In the meantime, lads, keep on top of it. Don't let your hand or her cheeks get lazy. Lasses, there are some wise people who've been telling you for 20 years to swim upstream, but there are wiser people who'll tell you to relax into it and go with your flow. Surrender to your nature. I'll talk to you in a week.